Okay, well, I'm going to ask one question and give Dinesh a chance to answer it, and then Christopher a chance to rebut his remarks. And then we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to questions after that. Now, this is a libertarian conference, and libertarians often argue from first principles. And so my question for Dinesh is, in your book, you claim that there is historical evidence to believe that Jesus of Nazareth lived a couple of millennia ago, that he actually performed the acts that are described in the gospel, and that even though historians would say that evidence for the life of Jesus and what he did outside of the gospel is scant. So does this evidence truly exist, and if it does, where are we to find it?
To me, one of the really interesting aspects of this religious debate is that in looking at the claims of religion, Christianity in this case, we often apply a standard that we don't apply to anyone else. So, for example, in God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens says, we don't even know if Christ even existed. He could have been a myth. And your question returns to that point. Now let me answer that question in a little different way. How do we know that Socrates existed? You can't go into a philosophy classroom in America or perhaps in the world and find a serious philosopher who doubts the existence of Socrates. And yet the truth of it is, the sources for Socrates are only two, Plato and Xenophon. And both are admiring worshippers of Socrates. Both are disciples, if you will, of Socrates, and they give contradictory pictures of him. Nevertheless, it is the unanimous conclusion of the philosophy departments of America that Socrates was a real guy. He really did walk the streets of Athens. Now, how do we know that Alexander the Great existed? My point is, when you look at the sources for the ancient world, in almost every case they are extremely scanty. The sources are very often dated to hundreds of years after the events that were described, and yet the historical assumption is we believe it to be true unless we have strong evidence to the contrary. If someone is digging up ancient archaeological remains in Egypt, you find the tomb of Tutankhamun with some writing on it, you believe that this is authentic unless you have reason to believe that somebody forged it. Only when it comes to Christianity, by the way, when you look at the gospel manuscripts, they are multiple. There are actually hundreds and hundreds of the reliability and authenticity of biblical manuscripts is far greater than any other document in the ancient world. The sources for the historicity of Christ are not limited to the four gospels. There are Jewish sources, Josephus. There are Greek sources. There are Roman sources. At one point, Tacitus, no admirer of Christianity, says there's a big hubbub going on somewhere in the outskirts of the empire. This crazy guy named Christus is causing the ruckus. Fortunately, the guy was crucified before he caused too much trouble. I'm saying this is the kind of evidence that in any other case would be, without a blink, accepted as legitimate. But because it is Christianity, the academic prejudice kicks in, the bar is lifted, and a different standard or compass is being applied. Notice I'm making no argument based on the Bible or Revelation. I'm simply calling for an even-handed application of scholarly and historical evidence. Now I'll consider very briefly the resurrection, which is the central miracle of Christianity. Here's the interesting historical fact. Christ is crucified. That's not so strongly argued about. Christ is buried, put in a tomb, and a stone is supposedly put in front of the tomb, and Roman guards are guarding it. Now, for 300 years or more, in the early Christian polemics between the Christians and the Jews asserted that the disciples stole the body. The disciples came and took Jesus' body. Interestingly, the Jews didn't say Christ was not crucified. They didn't say that the tomb wasn't empty. They admitted those things, but they claimed that the disciples must have somehow conned the Roman guards or rolled the stone away and stolen the body. Anyway, here's the point I want to get at. you've got these early disciples, and by the biblical accounts themselves, Christ is dead. They are dejected, feeling kind of low, you might say. And then something happens. Something rather weird happens, and this group of ragtag guys, relatively uneducated, and a relatively small group, suddenly becomes convinced that they have actually seen Christ. Not one or two guys, but many. And at one point, Paul refers to 500 witnesses, many of whom are still alive, although some, he says, have passed away. He's writing, by the way, within the 30 to 40 years after Christ. In other words, at a time when many people, if they disagreed with him, could have stood up and contested his account. Here's the point I'm getting at. These Christians then launched the largest conversion wave ever known to history. The only competition would perhaps be the spread of Islam in the desert 700 years later. But nevertheless, the Christians go from about 50 at the time of Christ's death to really a majority in the Roman Empire. The majority of Roman citizens were Christian before Constantine converted in the 4th century. Now you might say, well, maybe they just believed a lie. But then you've got to remember that the Romans put many of these people to death for what they believed, raising an interesting question. Someone can believe a lie or even wish for a lie, but why would someone die for a lie? Now you might say, well, the Muslims do. They want the 72 virgins in heaven. They're dying for a lie, but they don't know it's a lie. They're going to wake up in heaven and say, wait a minute, it's hot in here. But the point here is we're not talking about people expecting an unknown future reward. We're talking about people who would be dying for something they know not to be true. If one guy does it, he could be crazy. But when hundreds, thousands of people do it, it's a little bit like the debate about UFOs. People say, well, I can bring you 10 guys who say they saw UFOs. Well, you bring me 95% of human beings on the planet who saw UFOs, and I'll be looking for them myself. In other words, we live in a world where the vast majority of people not only believe in God, but claim to have some experience of Him. We're supposed to be libertarians, champions of realism, the real world, practical, empirical, valuing human experience. Is it really our position that the vast, vast majority of the world's people who we want to trust with freedom to use their money well and to organize their lives, but they are so deluded, these same people, that they are all living in the fantasy of something that simply doesn't exist? Why would such people not be better governed by some kind of a wise man who knows better? Freedom presumes that people are good judges of the validity of their own experience, that people are fairly reasonable about whether something is going to improve their life or not. That's why you trust them with their own money. That's why you trust them to meet and assemble and vote the way they do. So I'm arguing here that libertarianism at its deep level is based, I wouldn't say just on a Christian assumption, but I would say on the assumption that, on certain assumptions that we often ignore because they are underground. We are standing, if you will, on a political hill. We need to look at the ground below us. This idea that if I swing my fist, I should stop at your jaw. Why? If we are Darwinian primates, why? Show me someone in the animal kingdom that does that. I debated recently with Peter Singer about animal rights, and I told him the problem with animal rights is we can't get animals to respect animal rights. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.